the Nazarene were quite different. They were what I would call sort of Egypto-Judaism. Their religion had come out of Egypt along with Jesus. Out of Egypt I have called my son. That's why I think, I don't know about whether you would agree with this, Robert, but the Egyptian false prophet I identify with Jesus himself. Would you agree on that?
It makes sense. I kind of like the theory that it's Simon Magus, since the Pseudo-Clementines have him in Egypt when John the Baptist dies, and Dositheus, who was number 2 in succession, took over. Simon gets back and said, "What's going on here?" and so forth. But obviously, there's no way to know that. So the other view, I think Lena Einhorn upholds that. That makes sense too.
Yeah, the reason why I thought he might be the Egyptian false prophet is that the Egyptian false prophet took the 5,000 out into the wilderness. That was one of the things he did. And then the Egyptian false prophet had that meeting on the Mount of Olives that was interrupted by the Roman guard. Now, the only difference with the biblical version is that this was a major event, according to Josephus. So the Egyptian false prophet didn't just have a prayer meeting on the Mount of Olives. He had 30,000 armed soldiers. So that puts it in a different perspective. And that's why the Roman guard came out, because there was an insurrection going on. and that was the Egyptian false prophet. And Jesus did very much the same with his meeting on the Mount of Olives. So I think they were one and the same.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That would equate for Jesus being out from Egypt, because of course Jesus went to Egypt for his education. Out of Egypt I've called my son. And even within the Talmud, they say that Jesus came out of Egypt with the sacred name of God tattooed on his thigh. Doesn't say which name though. Would have been nice to know which one.
Hugh Schoenfield, in a book called According to the Hebrews, long ago, studied one version of the Toledo of Yeshu where you see this enacted, and it's kind of a little wilder and more colorful there, but it's the same story. And we always hear that this was a kind of caricature of the Gospels or of Jesus, a kind of anti-gospel. But as Schoenfield shows, there's very little even of disrespect aimed at Jesus in that book. Jesus is all the time saying, "You see, I fulfilled this prophecy and that one and the other one," and nobody ever even tries to refute it. And he said, "Is this an anti-Christian book, or is it a Jewish Christian book?" And he thinks it's the thought it was the gospel according to the Hebrews. That's probably too much of a jump, but nonetheless, I have to take that pretty seriously, that at least some version of this was actually a Jewish Christian text. For what that's worth, I don't know, but it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, the Jewish Christians, who I would equate with the fourth sect and the Nazarene. Yes. I like that book because it had some interesting knowledge which showed that the author understood some of the history that I've been looking at. Because there are two versions of the Toledoth Yeshu. One where Jesus is tried before Pontius Pilate. The other, he is tried before Queen Helena of the Agia Beni, the Queen of Edessa, because Queen Helena was the Queen of Edessa. And then we have this bizarre scene at the end where, they have this, they're all flying around and fighting each other and whatever. And they go to crucify Jesus. And they try to string Jesus up on various trees. And all of the trees reject him, so they can't crucify him. Apart from, they managed to actually string him up on the carob tree. And the carob tree is the locust tree. And the Edessan monarchs in all of the works I've been looking at are always called locusts. It's their nickname. Well, it's a derogatory nickname. They call them the locusts. Even within Acts of the Apostles, where we have Agabus, which I have, and I think Robert Eisenman has also linked Agabus with King Abgarus of Edessa.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, Agabus means the locust.
Oh.
That's why they changed the name. So they obviously know who this person was, but they deliberately changed the name because in, is it Greek or Aramaic? It must be Greek. Agabus means the locust.
Wow.
And they always call these monarchs the locusts. And they do it because they didn't like them. I think the reason for calling them locusts is why they call them also in history books, they say they are Arabs, Nabateans. So people translate that as being Nabatean, but I don't think it means Nabatean at all. They call them Arabs because Arab means the locust.
Oh boy.
So again,
Wow.
all the time they're being called the locust. And I think this is because they didn't like them. They considered them to be the same as the locusts of the plagues. So during the plagues, the locusts came out of the east and destroyed the Israelites and sent them on an exodus. Yeah, because that was a part of the plagues and they had to go on an exodus. And of course, the Edessan monarchy did exactly the same. They came out of the east, they caused trouble in Judea and sent the Jews on an exodus, which was the end of the Jewish revolt. And so they're identical. They're both locusts, you know. So they considered this monarchy. They considered this monarchy to be locusts, and yeah. So it wasn't a compliment.
Wow.
So
Wow.
yeah, that's one of many reasons why I think the Edessans are linked into this story. You know, a lot of people get very upset with that. I don't know why. I don't think it's that. I don't think it's that far left field from the normal story. I mean, if you're thinking of Roman provenance, which a lot of people are now sort of thinking of Roman provenance as being the explanation for the gospel story. This is Roman provenance. It's putting the gospel story into the Jewish revolt era. That's all it's doing. It's exactly the same. So it's no different to the various other commentators who are looking at Roman provenance.
I hear your no, I'm confusing something with James Valiant. Never mind. Yeah, the thing with Edessa and Abgarus and all that, that to me is so illuminating. And the Queen Helena and the famine under Claudius in Acts 11, I think it is. When I read Eisenman on that, I just thought, I don't have a time machine. I can't verify it, but I just feel sure he's right. That makes too much sense.
Yeah, but I don't think Eisenman went far enough because it's a long time since I've read his James, the brother of Jesus. But it sort of goes on, and I think he missed this little trick at the end of it because it says Agabus prophesied there would be a great famine throughout the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. That's why people think it was AD 48, 49, something of that nature. And then the disciples determined to send famine relief money, which we know was sent by Queen Helena of Adjibeni Edessa, which was sent to the elders in Jerusalem by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So that's the main problem here, that if you take this as being the same event, that this is King Abgarus of Edessa, it means that Saul, St. Paul, was an ambassador of Edessa. Now that changes the story quite a lot. It brings Edessa into the story, right into the center of the gospel story. That the main character from the New Testament, the guy who wrote most of the New Testament, was an ambassador of Edessa. that changes things somewhat. It means that a lot of the story has to be linked to Adiabeni Edessa and the monarchy, King Abgarus and Queen Helena, the two famous monarchs from northern Syria, who were in Judea at this time. Because remember, after this, I think Helena used this as a stepping stone. It might have been done deliberately, but after the famine relief money to Judea, she became the de facto queen of Judea. So she had the largest tomb and the largest palace in Jerusalem, which they're uncovering now. It's called the Giovanni parking lot. Yeah, they don't call it the palace of Queen Helena. They call it this Giovanni parking lot excavation. So they're still covering up the role of poor old Helena. She's still not being hailed as a great hero of Judaism.
Now
but
she's
anyway,
a meter maid.
Yeah, she's a meter maid. Yeah, so she was the one who furnished the Temple of Jerusalem. She sent the solid gold menorah came from Queen Helena for the Temple of Jerusalem. So in effect, she was the de facto queen of Judea at this time. This is the AD 50s, which again shows how central to this region and this story that they were.
Well, also Eisenman says that the clash of Cephas and Paul in Antioch would make sense if it wasn't the Antioch in Syria, but the one in Edessa, because it would make so much sense in connection with what Josephus tells us about the one Jewish missionary saying, you're a Gentile, maybe you should skip circumcision. You don't want the PR trouble. And then the next one comes along and says, well, look, I'm afraid you don't have that liberty. What does it say here in the Bible? Abraham, etc. You got to do this. Okay, I will. Isn't that like the men from James saying, no, Paul was wrong. You really do have to get circumcised. When I read that, I thought, again, I don't know, right? I don't have some kind of clairvoyant knowledge, but it makes so much sense. Boy.
Yeah, and it's exactly what Josephus Flavius says about Adiabeni, because he has exactly the same story with the two apostles going up to Adiabeni to teach them the ways of Judaism. And they've got the moderate, who's Ananias, who says you don't need circumcision. And then the next one came along.
Eliezer?
Eliza, yes. Eliza, yeah, came along. And he was the fundamentalist and said, you must have. And this was exactly the same story. It's the same story as we get from the Council of Jerusalem and everything else. But this was talking about Adiabeni. But we know that Adiabeni and Edessa are linked because Queen Helena of Adiabeni was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. So at the very least, these two regions and cities are linked. And in my view, Adiabeni was just a different name for Edessa. But yeah, we've got the three stories, which are virtually identical, all talking about the same thing, which was the conversion of the Adiabeni Edessan monarchy to Judaism. And that is probably what they were talking about within Acts of the Apostles and the Council of Jerusalem. That's what they were talking about. And again, that brings Edessa center story to the gospel story, if that's what James was talking about.
I think there is an underlying tendency of apologists to try to keep everything in as narrow a biblical flow as possible, so that you don't want there to have been syncretism with Gnosticism or mystery religions or anything like that. Oh, no. It's pure revelation from God with no admixture. And so Adiabene, Edessa, well, that's not really part of the explicit Bible story. So I don't know, but it just seems to me that that fits as a kind of a crippling, well, a set of blinders to a wider picture.
Yeah, and there was a very good reason for deleting them from history. I mean, it's not as if that this is inexplicable.
Mm.
Why would anyone deny that Adiabene Edessa was central to the story? Well, it's because Adiabene Edessa was centrally involved in the Jewish revolt. And it seems quite clear from the works of Josephus that they led the Jewish revolt. It was the princes and kings of Adiabene Edessa who destroyed the legion of Cestius. Was it Cestius? I can't remember. No, I can't remember. Anyway, the Roman army that was defeated in AD 66, I'll remember his name in a minute, that started the Jewish revolt. And then it was the monarchs of Adiabene Edessa who surrendered to Titus at the end of the Jewish revolt. That signified the end of the Jewish revolt. So they were intimately involved in this Jewish revolt era. And of course, Rome wouldn't want any mention of that. They didn't want people knowing you could revolt against Rome. And so, yes, of course, you would have to cover up the involvement of the Adiabene Edessan monarchy. And so if there was any mention of them within the works of Josephus or within the works of the Gospels, they would have to be deleted or renamed or something in order that, you know, that people didn't get the idea that you can revolt against Rome. And we know that Josephus did this because you can go through all the works of Josephus and you will find no mention whatsoever of Edessa or King Abgarus or King Manu or any of the other famous people. The only mention we get, of course, is Queen Helena, but then she is said to be of Adiabene, when we know that the Syriac historians say that she was the queen of Edessa. So yeah, they have been deleted, and the gospel story has done exactly the same. It's just deleted them from history. So you don't know their involvement in this story. But people must have known about this involvement and continued the cover-up because people like Eusebius came from Edessa. I don't think he was born in Edessa, but he was doing most of his writing while he was in Edessa. So even in that era of Eusebius, it was still a central component of the sort of Christian story.
Well, he preserves the letters between Abgarus and Jesus, whether maybe he fabricated them, but nonetheless, I think there's, this is one of my many harebrained theories, I admit, but when in the Gospel of John, these guys, these Greeks come to Philip, I think, and say, we would see Jesus, and then nothing happens. But then later we hear when Jesus says, I'm going away, and where I'm going, you can't follow me. What could he be talking about? I have this crazy hunch that the missing piece there is that these Greeks were from King Abgarus inviting Jesus to, come lie low here while you're in danger. And he says, I can't do that. I have my father's plan and so on, but don't worry, I'll send somebody. And that's what the critics of Jesus are commenting on. What is he planning to leave Palestine and go elsewhere? And the reason this is put in the mouths of the critics of Jesus is that the evangelist knows some people know this story and are saying that's what happened. And he's trying to say, just like the anti-docetic thing, unless I see the wounds and all that, he's trying to combat popular views that are inimical to his message. And I know it's extremely tenuous, but that would make so much sense of that otherwise thing with a missing link. And that would also mean you've got Adiabeni and Abgaras and all that in the story somewhere. But who knows?
Quite possibly. I mean, you know, when he's talking about the kingdom of heaven, and you know, the kingdom of heaven is nearby, and the kingdom of heaven is above, i.e., in the north. Again, it could well be talking about Edessa, because the matriarch of this family was Queen Theomusa Aurania.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I read that, and
her name means heaven, so she was the queen of heaven. So yeah, the kingdom of heaven was Edessa. Essentially, it was the Haran. So, yeah, it's very easy to mistranslate these texts into a fashion that you find convenient, rather than being utterly truthful. So yeah, you have to be very careful about reading the text and understanding these texts, because they can lead you astray, and they do that quite a lot.